September 1st, 1983.
Good evening. The Soviet ambassador to Japan says Russian search parties have found traces of an airliner crash off a Soviet island in the North Pacific. But Japan and the United States claim a Soviet fighter shot down the Korean Airlines jumbo jet with a missile.
Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down by a Soviet fighter plane over the Sea of Japan, killing the 269 people on board. At first appearances, the Soviets, unprovoked, had purposefully opened fire on a civilian aircraft. The world, and particularly the United States, from where the flight originated, were outraged.
Now, in the wake of the barbaric act committed yesterday by the Soviet regime against a commercial jetliner, the United States and many other countries of the world made clear and compelling statements that expressed not only our outrage, but also our demand for a truthful accounting of the facts.
The Soviets maintained the 747 was a spy plane, that the attack was justified, a story that wasn't completely told until decades later.
Approach his altitude and force the plane to land. In other words, they really didn't want to destroy it.
Today on Place and Time, we take a look at Flight 007, what went wrong, and how it changed our lives to this day. Please stick around. To set the stage, in September 1983, U.S. and Soviet relations are not exactly great. In March of that year, Ronald Reagan was addressing a church congregation where he coined a new phrase, referring to them as the evil empire. Soviet forces were doing a lot of military posturing in Europe, the Cold War was reaching an exhaustion point, but with the nuclear arms race where it was, both sides were on edge. Korean Air Flight 007 was scheduled from New York City to Seoul, South Korea, with a stop in Anchorage, Alaska. To get from Anchorage to Seoul, it needs to pass through one of 5 50-mile-wide airways known as the NOPAC routes that bridge the Alaskan and Japanese coasts. These were internationally agreed-upon safe paths for commercial airliners. Flight 007 is in the northernmost one, just 17 miles from Soviet airspace, which in 1983 was contentious. So to understand where this starts to go wrong, we'll need a quick detour to understand the onboard autopilot system. It has 4 modes. Heading mode maintains a constant magnetic course selected by the pilot. VOR or LOC mode directs the plane on a course transmitted from a short-range radio signal on a ground beacon. ILS is the landing system which tracks using beacons on a runway, and INS, the inertial navigation system, maintains the plane on lateral course lines between selected waypoints programmed into a computer. INS gets the correct waypoints and off you go across the ocean. So if you were a commercial airline pilot making this flight in 1983, your plane would take off, you'd get some instructions from air traffic control, and you'd engage heading mode accordingly to point you on a course to intercept one of the VOR beacons, which hands you off to an INS course line. You switch to INS mode, you track using the waypoints the rest of the way until landing. KAL 007 takes off. It's in heading mode, and the very first beacon it's supposed to intercept in Anchorage is having some maintenance done to it, so it's not functional. Still, no problem. The next one's in Bethel, only 346 miles away. Air traffic control tells them to go to Bethel, engage VOR mode, find the beacon, then switch to INS mode, because after Bethel there isn't another VOR station for a while, hundreds of miles away in Japan. If they don't switch into INS mode, they'll drift farther and farther north into heavily protected Russian airspace. And that's exactly what happens next. Sort of. So the plane's supposed to fly over Bethel, where it's going to enter its NOPAC route. Again, that northernmost of the 5 safe paths for planes to take, but only 17 miles from Soviet airspace. The International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, simulation and analysis of the flight data recorder offers 2 potential explanations for what happens next. The autopilot system stays operating in heading mode, past where it should have been switched to INS mode. This was either because the crew didn't switch the autopilot to INS mode, or they did select it, but the computer didn't transition from the armed position where it's seeking an INS waypoint to the capture condition where it locks on, possibly due to being beyond the range tolerated by the computer, which is about 7.5 miles or 12 kilometers. "28 minutes after takeoff, it's picked up on civilian radar about 5.6 miles north of where it should have been. 50 miles after takeoff, they're tracked again 12.6 miles north of where they should have been. They're 60 miles off course at the next waypoint, and at this point they're so far off course they're unable to transmit their position to other crafts or ground traffic control. By the time they leave what's considered American territorial waters, they're over 100 miles off course. And at 1551 UTC, KAL-007 enters the Kamchatka Peninsula, restricted Soviet airspace and home to a lot of military installations. The Soviets scramble 4 MiG-23 fighter jets to intercept it, but before they can get close, it's back into international airspace. But now it's all hands on deck at the Soviet Air Defense Forces. They're tracking this plane, they believe it's a spy plane, we'd later find out they're having chain of command battles on whether or not to shoot it down. And by the time it re-enters their airspace over Sakhalin, it's classified as a military target, and several more miscommunications follow. The Soviets send 3 fighters to check it out. The lead pilot fires some warning shots with his cannon. They're trying to make out whether it's a civilian plane. And at this point, everything else that can go wrong does. It's best summarized by the 1993 ICAO report, which contains the transcripts of recordings of the KAL-007 pilots between one another, juxtaposed with what was happening in real time on Russian communication channels. I've linked that report in the show notes, but essentially, when the warning shots are fired, KA-007's pilots don't see it, but they communicate with Tokyo and request to increase altitude to save fuel at the price of speed. Their communication is poor, but they get the approval and immediately begin to increase altitude and slow down, something the Soviet pilots interpret as an evasive maneuver. And their ground base gives the order to shoot it down. Major Gennady Osipovich, the pilot that shot the 747 down, recalls in a 1991 interview,
"I could see 2 rows of windows which were lit up. I wondered if it was a civilian aircraft. Military cargo planes don't have such windows. I wondered what kind of plane it was, but I had no time to think. I had a job to do. I started to signal to him in international code. I informed him that he'd violated our airspace. He did not respond."
At 1826, the plane is hit and crashes, killing the 269 people on board. The next day, U.S. President Ronald Reagan has a short address. That's the clip you heard at the top.
But also our demand for a truthful accounting of the facts.
World leaders are condemning it, and facts are slowly trickling out. But the moment that changes everything is yet to come. September 5th, in his address to the nation.
I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre.
The Soviets aren't acknowledging they shot down the plane, but a ground station has the recording of their pilots' communications.
Here's a brief segment of the tape, which we're going to play in its entirety for the United Nations Security Council tomorrow.
He lays out the case like an attorney,
On what we know was a clear night with a half moon.
trying to break down every aspect of what he knows isn't the whole story.
The 747 has a unique and distinctive silhouette, unlike any other plane in the world. There is no way a pilot could mistake this for anything other than a civilian airliner. He says he has locked on the radar, which aims his missiles, has launched those missiles. The target has been destroyed, and he is breaking off the attack.
The Soviets said it looked a lot like an RC-135, a U.S. spy plane.
Let me point out our RC-135 that I mentioned earlier had been back at its base in Alaska on the ground for an hour.
But amid all the admonishment,
But we shouldn't be surprised by such inhuman brutality.
and high ground,
It would be easy to think in terms of vengeance, but that is not a proper answer. We want justice and action to see that this never happens again.
he mentions he's been working with Congress,
And I received a number of constructive suggestions,
and that his primary purpose is
working out a system to protect against this ever happening again.
September 16, 1983, Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speaks in his press briefing reads a statement again admonishing the Soviet Union, but adding, quote, "World opinion is united in its determination that this awful tragedy must not be repeated. As a contribution to the achievement of this objective, the President has determined that the United States is prepared to make available to civilian aircraft the facilities of its global positioning system when it becomes operational in 1988. This system will provide civilian airliners three-dimensional positional information."
The Navstar Global Positioning System is a space-based network of satellites, transmitting precise, jam-resistant radio navigational signals.
It should be noted here that there were commercial GPS applications already underway, and the system was always intended for civilian use. But it's widely agreed that this decision catapulted the adoption of GPS free of charge into the building block of infrastructure it is today.
The Global Positioning System can pinpoint an aircraft, land vehicle, or seagoing vessel within 16 meters or 52 feet of its actual location in longitude, latitude, altitude, and speed.
The initial investigation is inconclusive. The Soviets hold their ground. They claim they weren't able to recover the black box from the crash site, which they were heavily protecting. They're sticking to their story. They thought it was a spy plane. The facts of what happened, and particularly the search and rescue efforts following, slowly trickle out over the next decade through the Glasnost reforms. In 1991, Senator Jesse Helms writes to Boris Yeltsin asking for information about that thing, we've been asking you about for 8 years. And Yeltsin, true to his word of trying to join the world stage, releases memos proving that the Soviets recovered the plane's cockpit voice recorder just 50 days after the crash, but held it secret because it didn't support the narrative that it was a spy plane. And it isn't until 1993 when the ICAO reopens the investigation, having received tapes of the ground-to-air communications of the Soviet military, that missing half of the conversation that Reagan played in his address. Combined with the synchronized to the second ground and air recordings, the picture is so much more clear. Flight 007 had no idea they were in danger. The Soviet command truly thought it was a spy plane, and darkness was just another in a long list of causes of the tragedy. At 1749 UTC, as the plane is past Kamchatka and is into neutral waters, Captain Solikov, the combat control officer at the airbase on Sakhalin Island, says, quote, "2 pilots have just been sent up. Command at the command post. We do not know what is happening just now. It's headed straight for our island. This looks very suspicious to me. I don't think the enemy is stupid. Can it be one of ours?" 1753, General Anatoly Kornikov, commander of the airbase to the command post of General Valery Kamensky, commander of Air Defense Forces to the Far East Military District. Quote, "Simply destroy it if it's over neutral waters? Are the orders to destroy it over neutral waters?" 20 minutes later, as fighters are scrambling in a conversation between Soviet generals Kornikov and Kamensky, Kornikov says, quote, "The target is not responding to identify. He cannot identify it visually because it's still dark, but he is still locked on." Kamensky replies, "We must find out. Maybe it's some civilian craft or God knows who." To which Kornikov rebuts, "What civilian? It has flown over Kamchatka. It came from the ocean without identification. I am giving the order to attack if it crosses the state border." Just 1 minute later, in a conversation between colonels, quote, "Identification measures are being taken, but the pilot cannot see. It's dark. Even now, it's still dark." With the reply of, "Well, okay, the task is correct. If there are no lights, it cannot be a passenger," meaning aircraft. And just a few minutes later, the confirmation from Tokyo Air Traffic Control to Korean Flight 007 to climb, raising their altitude and slowing their speed. 2 minutes later, Osipovich, reporting what he sees to the ground in real time, is given the order to fire. The ICAO revised its report and adopted a resolution condemning the Soviet Union for the attack. A few years later, an amendment was adopted at the Convention on International Civil Aviation that further defined the use of force against civilian airliners in more detail. The amendment reads, quote, "The contracting states recognize that every state must refrain from resorting to the use of weapons against civil aircraft in flight, and that in case of interception, the lives of persons on board and the safety of aircraft must not be endangered." Ultimately, it was Korean Air that paid the victims' compensation, and the world which benefited from the advancements that became possible with precise time and location data made available by GPS. Pilots in air traffic control around the world now know where every commercial plane is in the sky at all times, and autopilot systems have advanced to the degree that it would be difficult to make such an error. It would be even harder for it to go unnoticed as long as it did in 1983. Again, in the show notes, you'll find the 1993 ICAO report, a great 2001 follow-up report from NASA on the lessons learned and recommendations for prevention, and a few other resources I used in the production of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to Place and Time. Hit subscribe if you want to hear future episodes, and if you really enjoyed what you heard, consider sharing it with someone or leaving us a review wherever you got this podcast. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.